And welcome. Today, we're journeying back in time to the summer of 1914, to a Europe teetering on the edge of a cataclysm that would change the world forever. This is the story of how the Great War began. Imagine Europe at the dawn of the 20th century. It wasn't a harmonious continent. Instead, it was a powder keg, divided into two massive, armed camps. On one side, you had the Triple Entente, the Democratic Republic of France, the vast empire of Tsarist Russia, and the global naval power of Great Britain. On the other, the Central Powers, the industrial might of the German Empire, led by Kaiser Wilhelm II, the sprawling and multi-ethnic Austro-Hungarian Empire, and later, the Ottoman Empire. These alliances were meant to keep the peace through a balance of power, but in reality, they created a web of promises that could drag everyone into a conflict started by just two nations. Beneath the surface of imperial grandeur, tensions were simmering. A furious naval arms race was underway between Britain and Germany, with each nation building bigger, more powerful battleships, each one a floating fortress of steel and firepower. Nationalism was also on the rise, a fervent, sometimes aggressive, patriotism that set peoples against each other. Nowhere was this more explosive than in the Balkans, a region seething with ethnic rivalries and aspirations for independence from the aging Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires. The military planners were not idle. Germany, led by Kaiser Wilhelm II, felt encircled. To its west was France, bitter after its defeat in the Franco-Prussian War. To its east was the colossal Russian Empire, ruled by Wilhelm's cousin, Tsar Nicholas II. German military staff looked at the numbers and saw a daunting reality. The combined peacetime armies of France and Russia outnumbered their own forces and those of their ally, Austria-Hungary, by nearly 1 million men. This fear of a two-front war would drive Germany's strategy and, ultimately, its fateful decisions. The stage was set. The actors were in place. And all that was needed was a single spark to ignite the entire continent. That spark came on a sunny June morning in 1914. The 28th of June, to be precise, in the city of Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia and Herzegovina province, annexed by Austria-Hungary. Just a few years earlier, a royal visit was underway. Archduke Franz Ferdinand the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, and his wife, Sophie, were touring the city in an open-topped car. For many Serbs living in Bosnia, the Archduke represented an oppressive foreign rule. Among them was a young man named Gavrilo Princip. He was a member of a nationalist group, fueled by a dream of a unified South Slav nation, free from Austrian control. Earlier that day, the royal couple had already survived one assassination attempt when a bomb thrown at their car bounced off and exploded beneath the vehicle behind them. Shaken but determined to continue, Franz Ferdinand decided to visit the wounded in the hospital, but a fatal error in communication sent their motorcade down the wrong street. As the driver tried to reverse, the car stalled. By a staggering coincidence, it stopped right in front of Gavrilo Princip. Seizing his chance, Princip stepped forward, raised his pistol, and fired 2 shots. One struck Sophie, the other hit the Archduke. Wheaton in a war. Both were dead. The fuse had been lit. News of the assassination sent shockwaves across Europe. In Vienna, the capital of Austria-Hungary, outrage was mixed with a sense of opportunity. For years, hardliners in the government had wanted to crush Serbia, which they saw as a source of instability and a threat to their empire. Now, they had the perfect excuse, but they wouldn't act alone. They sought the backing of their powerful ally, Germany. Kaiser Wilhelm II and his government offered Austria-Hungary what became known as the blank check, a promise of unconditional support for whatever action Austria decided to take against Serbia. Emboldened by this German guarantee, on July 23rd, Austria-Hungary issued an ultimatum to Serbia. It was a list of 10 demands, deliberately designed to be so harsh that no sovereign nation could accept them all. The demands included suppressing all anti-Austrian propaganda and allowing Austrian officials to participate in the investigation of the assassination on Serbian soil. It was an astonishing challenge to Serbia's independence. Against all odds, Serbia gave a masterful diplomatic reply, agreeing to almost every single point, except for the one that would have completely violated its sovereignty. But for Austria-Hungary, it wasn't enough. They had wanted war, and now they would have it. The dominoes began to fall, one after another, with terrifying speed. On July 28, 1914, exactly 1 month after the assassination, Austria-Hungary officially declared war on Serbia. The intricate system of alliances, designed to prevent a major war, now ensured it. Russia saw itself as the protector of the Slavic peoples, especially the Serbs. In response to the declaration of war, Tsar Nicholas II ordered the mobilization of Russia's gigantic army. This was a critical step. In the military thinking of the time, mobilization was seen as an act of war itself. It was a massive, complex process that, once started, was almost impossible to stop. Germany watched Russia's mobilization with alarm. Their entire war plan depended on speed. On August 1st, Germany declared war on Russia. Now, the German generals had to act on their greatest fear: the two-front war. They had a plan for this, a daring and risky strategy called the Schlieffen Plan. The plan assumed Russia would be slow to mobilize its forces. So, Germany would first launch a lightning-fast, overwhelming attack against France in the west. The goal was to knock France out of the war in just 6 weeks. With France defeated, Germany could then turn its full military might to the east to deal with Russia. But there was a catch, and it was a big one. To achieve the speed needed to outflank the French armies, the German invasion had to go through a small, neutral country, Belgium. 2 days after declaring war on Russia, on August 3rd, Germany declared war on France and set the Schlieffen Plan in motion. German troops began pouring across the border into neutral Belgium. This single act would have profound consequences. It would bring the world's largest empire into the war. For decades, Great Britain had pursued a policy of splendid isolation from continental affairs, but it had one commitment it could not ignore: the Treaty of London of 1839, which guaranteed Belgium's neutrality. The German invasion was a direct violation of that treaty. For Britain, allowing a hostile power to control the Belgian coast, just a stone's throw from its own shores, was unthinkable. The British government issued an ultimatum to Germany: withdraw your troops from Belgium immediately. Germany, focused on its timetable for defeating France, refused. The German chancellor dismissed the treaty as a mere scrap of paper. For Britain, it was a matter of honor, treaty obligation, and national security. On August 4th, 1914, Great Britain declared war on Germany. The British Empire, with its vast resources and its command of the seas, was now in the fight. Soon after, the small but highly trained soldiers of the British Expeditionary Force, the BEF, began landing in France to take their place alongside their French allies. In just over a month, a regional crisis in the Balkans had exploded into a continental war. The great powers of Europe, linked by alliances and driven by fear, nationalism, and ambition, had stumbled into a conflict of a scale never seen before. Millions of men were on the march, cheered on by patriotic crowds who believed the war would be a grand adventure, over by Christmas. They could not have been more wrong. The descent into the abyss was complete. The lights were going out all over Europe, and they would not be lit again for 4 long, brutal years. When the cannons first roared in August 1914, most soldiers believed the war would be over by Christmas. They were tragically mistaken. Today, we're diving into the pivotal year of 1914, exploring how the initial rapid advances ground to a brutal halt, creating the infamous stalemate of the Western Front. It all began with Germany's grand strategy, Schlieffen. The idea was to deliver a swift, knockout blow to France by sweeping through neutral Belgium, encircling Paris, and forcing a quick surrender. This would allow Germany to then turn its full attention to the much larger, but slower to mobilize Russian army in the east. Initially, the plan worked with chilling efficiency. German armies poured through Belgium and into northern France, pushing the French and the small but professional British Expeditionary Force back relentlessly. By early September, the situation looked dire for the Allies. German forces were on the outskirts of Paris, so close they could reportedly see the Eiffel Tower. The French government even packed its bags and fled the capital for Bordeaux. Paris, the heart of France, was on the brink of falling. But then, the tide turned. In a desperate last-ditch effort, the French military commander, General Joseph Joffre, rallied his exhausted troops. From September 6th to the 12th, the First Battle of the Marne raged. In a legendary move known as the Miracle of the Marne, thousands of French soldiers were famously rushed from Paris to the front lines. In a fleet of taxicabs, this unexpected reinforcement helped plug a critical gap in the Allied line. The combined French and British forces launched a fierce counterattack, catching the overextended German First Army by surprise. The German advance was not just halted, it was reversed. Exhausted and with their supply lines stretched thin, the Germans were forced to retreat, pulling back about 40 miles to the Aisne River Valley. Paris was saved. The Schlieffen Plan had failed. A quick victory was now impossible. With the hope of a swift war shattered, a new and desperate phase began. The race to the sea. After the Battle of the Marne, both sides realized the war wouldn't be won by a single decisive blow. Instead, they tried to outmaneuver each other, attempting to swing around the northern end of their opponent's flank. This series of flanking movements stretched northward, through France, and into the Flanders region of Belgium. Each side tried to get to the coast first, hoping to gain a strategic advantage and cut off the enemy's supply lines from the sea. This race wasn't a sprint. It was a brutal series of bloody battles fought over towns and villages. The race culminated in late October and November at the First Battle of Ypres, a medieval city in Belgium that would become synonymous with the horrors of the war. By the end of this phase, the line of battle stretched uninterrupted for over 400 miles, from the English Channel all the way to the Swiss border. There was no flank left to turn, and so, the most enduring image of World War I was born. Trench warfare. To protect themselves from the devastating firepower of modern artillery and machine guns, soldiers on both sides dug in. What started as simple ditches quickly evolved into vast, complex networks of trenches. These weren't just single lines, they were elaborate systems with frontline trenches, support trenches, and communication trenches, all protected by massive tangles of barbed wire. The armies now faced each other across a terrifying new landscape. No man's land. This was the stretch of ground between the opposing trench lines. A desolate, moon-like expanse of mud, shell craters, and the grim remains of previous attacks. It was a kill zone, swept by machine gun fire and artillery. The central problem for military commanders became, how do you cross this ground and break the enemy's line without suffering catastrophic casualties? Their inability to solve this tactical puzzle led to a war of attrition. A gruesome stalemate where victory was measured not in miles gained, but in the number of enemy soldiers killed. Millions would die in futile attempts to cross no man's land. While the Western Front was locking into this deadly embrace, the war in the East was a very different story. Here, the front was much longer and the troop concentrations lower, which allowed for a war of movement. As Germany had feared, Russia mobilized its massive army faster than anticipated. Russian forces invaded East Prussia, forcing Germany to divert troops from the west, a move that contributed to the failure of the Schlieffen Plan. However, the Russian advance was soon met with a crushing German response. At the Battle of Tannenberg, in late August 1914, the German Eighth Army, under the command of two officers who would become legendary figures, Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff, executed a brilliant encirclement. They virtually annihilated the Russian Second Army, capturing over 90,000 prisoners. It was a staggering victory for Germany and a devastating blow to Russia, from which its army never fully recovered its pre-war confidence. As 1914 drew to a close, the conflict expanded globally. In November, the Ottoman Empire, with its vast territories in the Middle East, entered the war on the side of the Central Powers Germany and Austria. This was a hugely significant development. It threatened Russia's southern flank, cut off a key Allied supply route through the Dardanelles Strait, and opened up new fronts in the Caucasus and the Middle East. Britain and France were forced to declare war on the Ottomans, turning a European conflict into a true world war. Yet, amidst all this escalating violence and the entrenchment of hatred, one of the most remarkable and poignant events of the entire war took place. As Christmas approached, the first of the war, something incredible happened. In various sectors of the Western Front, particularly in the mud-soaked fields around Ypres, and a place the British soldiers called Plug Street in Belgium. The fighting just stopped. Spontaneously, soldiers began to climb out of their trenches. Not to fight, but to celebrate Christmas. It started with the sound of carols drifting across no man's land, German soldiers singing Still Noch, answered by British soldiers singing the first Noel. Then, brave individuals cautiously emerged, unarmed, into the frozen wasteland between the lines. They met their enemies face to face. They shook hands. They exchanged small gift cigarettes, buttons from their uniforms, tins of food. They shared photos of their families. In so many places, they even arranged to bury their dead who lay in no man's land. For a few brief hours on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, these men saw each other not as the enemy, but as fellow human beings, caught in the same dreadful situation. This was the Christmas truce of 1914. It was unofficial, unauthorized, and horrified the high commands on both sides. It was a fleeting moment of shared humanity. A tiny flicker of peace in a world descending into darkness. It would not be repeated. The war would go on for 4 more brutal years. But the memory of that truce serves as a powerful reminder that even in the darkest of times, the spirit of human connection can endure. Now, we're entering the middle years, where the war not only escalates, but transforms, spreading across the globe and introducing terrifying new ways to fight. By 1915, the conflict was no longer just a European affair. Italy, initially neutral, cast its lot with the Allies, opening a new, grueling front in the treacherous terrain of the Alps. Farther east, the Allies launched an ambitious but ultimately disastrous campaign at Gallipoli, hoping to knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war and open a sea route to Russia. The campaign failed, costing hundreds of thousands of lives and becoming a defining moment for nations like Australia and New Zealand. But the biggest change was happening on the battlefields themselves. The stalemate on the Western Front pushed both sides to innovate, leading to the development of horrific new weapons. In 1915, at the Second Battle of Ypres, German forces unleashed poison gas for the first time with devastating success. Clouds of chlorine gas drifted across no man's land, choking and killing Allied soldiers, and adding a new layer of psychological terror to the war. Soon, both sides were using various chemical agents, and the eerie, ghoulish gas mask became a haunting symbol of the conflict. The following year, the British introduced another groundbreaking weapon: the tank. These lumbering steel behemoths, first seen at the Battle of the Somme, were designed to cross trenches and break through barbed wire. While early models were slow and unreliable, they represented the future of mechanized warfare. At sea, German U-boats or submarines waged a ruthless campaign against Allied shipping, aiming to starve Britain into submission. This unrestricted warfare at sea would have consequences far beyond the naval blockade. The year 1916 is burned into history for 2 of the most brutal battles in human history: Verdun and the Somme. At Verdun, the Germans launched a massive offensive with the grim strategy of bleeding France white. For 10 months, the 2 armies tore each other apart in a hellish landscape of mud and shell craters. The French held on, but at a staggering cost. To relieve the pressure on Verdun, the British and their allies launched their own major offensive at the Somme. The first day alone was the deadliest in the history of the British Army, with nearly 60,000 casualties. By the time these 2 battles ended, the total number of dead and wounded exceeded 1 million. These names, Verdun and the Somme, became synonymous with the senseless slaughter of the Great War. The year 1917 would be the pivotal turning point. Tensions between Germany and the United States had been simmering for years, largely due to Germany's submarine warfare. In early 1917, Germany made a fateful decision. It announced the resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare, meaning its U-boats would sink any ship, neutral or otherwise, heading to Britain. This was a massive gamble. The German High Command knew it would likely bring the US into the war. But they bet they could win before American forces could make a difference. American ships, like the SS Aztec, were sunk, and American lives were lost. Public outrage in the US was already high, but it was about to boil over. British intelligence intercepted and decoded a secret message from Germany's Foreign Secretary, Arthur Zimmermann, to the government of Mexico. This message, now known as the Zimmerman Telegram, was astonishing. It proposed a military alliance between Germany and Mexico if the United States entered the war against Germany. In return for its support, Germany promised to help Mexico reclaim lost territories: Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. When the telegram was published in American newspapers, it was a bombshell. The idea of a German-backed war on American soil was the final straw. On April 2, 1917, President Woodrow Wilson stood before Congress and delivered a powerful address. He argued that the world was facing a challenge to its very foundations of peace and freedom. He famously declared, "The world must be made safe for democracy." 4 days later, the United States officially declared war on Germany. The American Expeditionary Forces, or AEF, were quickly assembled under the command of General John J. Pershing. American soldiers, known as doughboys, began crossing the Atlantic. Their stars and stripes flag a new sight on the European continent. While it would take time to train, equip, and transport these millions of men, their eventual arrival would provide a much-needed surge of fresh manpower and morale for the exhausted Allies. But as one great power entered the war, another was collapsing from within. Also in 1917, Russia was racked by revolution. After years of devastating losses, food shortages, and political turmoil, the Russian people had had enough. The Tsar was overthrown, and later that year, the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, seized power. Lenin's government had promised the Russian people peace, land, and bread, and they moved quickly to deliver on the peace part. In March 1918, they signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany. The treaty was incredibly harsh, forcing Russia to give up vast territories, but it officially took Russia out of the war. For Germany, this was a massive strategic victory. With the Eastern Front now closed, they could transfer nearly 1 million battle-hardened troops to the west. This gave them a temporary numerical advantage, and the German High Command decided to risk everything on one final, desperate gamble to win the war before the Americans arrived in overwhelming force. In the spring of 1918, Germany launched a series of massive attacks known as the Spring Offensive, or the Kaiserschlacht, the Kaiser's Battle. Using new stormtrooper tactics, they punched through the Allied lines, advancing further than either side had in years. For a moment, it looked as though they might actually succeed. Paris was once again in range of their heavy artillery, but the German army was exhausted. They had outrun their supply lines, and their soldiers were at the breaking point. The offensive stalled, and just as the German push ran out of steam, the full might of the American forces began to be felt. Fresh, well-fed, and eager for a fight, the doughboys plugged the gaps in the Allied lines and played a key role in stopping the last German attacks at battles like Chateau Thierry and Belleau Wood. Their presence was a massive blow to German morale and a huge boost for the Allies. With the German offensive halted, the initiative shifted. The Allies, now unified under the command of French Marshal Ferdinand Foch, were ready to strike back. In the summer of 1918, they launched a coordinated counterattack known as the 100 Days Offensive. Using tanks, aircraft, and infantry in a combined arms approach, the Allies relentlessly pushed the Germans back across all the territory they had gained. The German army began to crumble. Meanwhile, Germany's allies were collapsing. Bulgaria surrendered in September, followed by the Ottoman Empire in October. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, torn apart by internal nationalist movements, disintegrated and signed an armistice in early November. Back in Germany, the war effort had collapsed. The population was starving due to the British naval blockade, and sailors in the German fleet mutinied, sparking widespread revolts across the country. Facing civil unrest and a military defeat, Kaiser Wilhelm II had no choice. On November 9th, he abdicated and fled to the Netherlands. With the Kaiser gone, the new German government immediately sought an end to the fighting. At 5 a.m. on the morning of November 11th, 1918, representatives from Germany and the Allied powers met in a railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne, France. There, they signed the armistice, an agreement to cease hostilities. The terms dictated that the fighting would stop at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. As the clock ticked towards 11 a.m., the guns on the Western Front continued to fire, right up to the last minute. Then, a strange, unfamiliar silence fell over the battlefields. After 4 long, brutal years, the Great War was finally over. The joy and relief were immense, but they were tempered by the staggering scale of the loss. An entire generation had been scarred, and the world was changed forever. But the end of the fighting was not the end of the story.